Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, May 19th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, growth across federal contractors averaged about 15% in 2025, according to Deltek's latest Clarity report. But that growth is showing up alongside new pressure on margins, controls, and visibility. Plus, federal contractors are doing more than just delivering programs. They're helping the government respond when conditions change quickly. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The State Department is directing managers to go back and revise recently submitted annual performance evaluations to give employees lower scores. That's all part of recent government-wide guidance limiting the number of top scores that federal employees can receive. Impacted employees say these changes could disrupt the collaborative nature of their diplomatic work. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more insight. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
What is the new policy for federal employee performance evaluations? I mean, I guess across all agencies to start.
Right. So this does affect all agencies. This is coming down from the Office of Personnel Management. They released a proposed rule back in February that would limit how many federal employees can receive the highest rankings on their annual performance reviews. And just by way of an introduction here, typically, these agencies work on a 1 to 5 system, 1 being the lowest, 5 being outstanding. And so what they're being asked to do here is remove a current ban on forced distributions, meaning that there would be a finite number of 5s, a finite number of 4s, and so on and so forth. And that really agencies should be being more strenuous with their grades, that a 5 should really mean something, that there's a high standard to that score. OPM says that this will hold federal employees to be more rigorous with their scoring, and that ultimately there will be more of a pay-for-performance type rollout from there.
What does this look like at the State Department? Is it feeling different there?
It is, yeah. So what we're seeing play out here at the State Department in reference to everything we mentioned with OPM is that the State Department is asking human resources officials and raters to go back and review and recalibrate employee performance reviews that they've already submitted. This is a fairly late in the cycle request. May is kind of the crunch time for May evaluation work. So with that in mind here, the State Department is asking raters and its HR team to go back and recalibrate these performance reviews. This is fairly late in the process. May is kind of the time where all of this gets buttoned up and submitted. And this is all happening because the department says that these scores are ultimately too high, that they're trying to get to an average of about 3.25 for its workforce, at least for the Foreign Service. That's worth pointing out here. And that they are trying to have people really aligned to that average that they've set forth.
Jory, this is the first performance cycle that we're seeing this new guidance play out. Feels like we've been talking about it for a while, but this is the first time it's being applied. What are the impacted employees saying about how these changes are rolling out?
They're saying a lot of things, one of them being that this is fairly late in the process, that going from a largely text-based to numerical rating system, that these are all forms that they've received only a couple of weeks ago, so that they are all kind of building the plane as they're flying it, so to speak. And so there's some pain points there with all of that. Another point here is that people are concerned that this is going to push more diplomats out of the Foreign Service at a time when they've already lost a couple hundred as a part of widespread reductions in force, because the Foreign Service operates much like the military. There's an up or out promotion system where if you don't get promoted within a certain window of time in your career in the Foreign Service, you're basically shown the door. You're saying that these are people that we're not investing more time and resources in, and that they should be doing other work. And that's more likely when there are finite top scores being distributed across the workforce here. And one other component of that is that the State Department is bringing back the idea of low ranking, the idea that if there are people who are scoring low on their performance evaluations, that they may be recommended for removal. One other element here is that, based on what I've heard from Foreign Service officers familiar with everything going on here, junior employees in some cases have been asked to accept lower scores to the point where they're no longer in a position to be recommended for promotion, and that those higher scores have in essence been saved for more senior staff who may be competing for performance pay.
Has the State Department issued an official agency position here?
The State Department did not get back to me in terms of requests for comments for this story, but I did see a number of emails that really outline the State Department's position on all of this. One dating back to the end of March, Undersecretary for Management Jason Evans said that in recognition of OPM's guidance that a fully successful rating, a 3 out of 5, would be considered the standard baseline for performance across all criteria that Foreign Service employees are being graded on, and that in some cases, entire posts may not have any employees that score a 5. He says that's to be expected, and that ultimately this is all about addressing grade inflation. Everyone I spoke to for the story did concede that some of that does happen or did happen under the old system, and that they are trying to ultimately crack down on grade inflation, making sure that a 5 really does mean something, and that it is an indicator that these are kind of the future leaders of the department rising up the ranks.
The State Department does have a pretty active advocacy support group around its workforce. What is that group saying about this approach?
You're right about that. We did hear from the American Foreign Service Association about all these changes. They're concerned. They raise issue with this being happening fairly last minute in the process. They say that these were last minute changes to the employee review process. They were poorly conceived, poorly communicated, and deeply disruptive. That's AFSA saying all of this. And they say that this is not the kind of thing that you want to have out there when the Foreign Service is also trying to do some recruiting. They had a pretty aggressive social media campaign out recently saying that they are trying to bring in new members of the Foreign Service. And this is also at a time when the Foreign Service did recently officially separate about 250 Foreign Service officers from rifts that began last summer. So all this is happening simultaneously, but AFSA says this is not the kind of message you want out there when you're trying to bring in new recruits.
Jory, even with all of the concerns that we've just walked through, you haven't seen any indication that that's going to change anything that the State Department is doing right now. This process is going to roll out until it's finished.
That seems to be what I'm hearing and seeing in all of this. The State Department did recognize, because some of this is being dropped on people last minute, that they have pushed back the deadlines here a little bit. We're talking a matter of weeks to buy people more time here, that all of this should be finished up and submitted by the end of this month, by the end of May, that these ratings and these evaluations should be completed, submitted to leadership, and then the next steps from there will go forward.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for this update.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, growth across federal contractors averaged about 15% in 2025, according to Deltek's latest Clarity report. But that growth is showing up alongside new pressure on margins, controls, and visibility. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Deltek's 2026 Clarity report shows a widening divide inside the federal contracting market. The firms growing fastest aren't just adding revenue, they're maintaining tighter controls and fewer hidden risks at the same time. Kevin Plexico, Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltek, explains what the data shows about balancing speed and scrutiny across the market right now. Kevin, it is great to have you back on the show and talk about the latest edition of Deltek's GovCon Clarity Report. Welcome back.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to be back on with you.
This is the 17th edition of this report. It's amazing how time flies. Last year was a pretty tricky year for contractors. What really stuck out to you at the highest levels as you looked through the data?
Oh, geez, definitely a tricky year. Lots of change taking place. And for some companies, I think it was good change, or at least change that benefited them from a business point of view. And obviously, there's some spots in other agencies and for other companies that was very difficult. So I think overall, the industry did pretty well. But when you look at it, there's definitely like a lot of haves and have-nots, depending on what agencies you were doing business in. You know, agencies that were, or companies doing business in like the Agency for International Development, and obviously went through a very difficult time. And others doing work in the aerospace defense market did very well because of the way that spending occurred.
One of the themes that comes through really clearly is the need for speed, but not speed by itself. In fact, the report says very clearly that speed is a requirement, but it's not sufficient to be competitive. What was it that showed up most clearly in the data that brought that theme forward?
It was a couple different things. It wasn't like one metric. It was sort of the theme of metrics. One of the things I would mention is sort of this dynamic between AI implementation. We saw AI implementation leap from 45% of companies that were using it to 90% of companies using it, but only 5% felt like they had proper governance over it. So I think that's one area where we're definitely seeing companies trying to move quicker and adopt some of these capabilities to drive efficiencies and productivity. I think one of the other dynamics that we saw was while there was pretty healthy growth on average in the market, 15% growth, which might actually be a surprise to some in the market, there was a decline in profitability. And there's definitely a lot of focus on how do we put in place more cost controls and make sure that as we're responding to this rapid change of using OTAs, some of the demands that the administration is putting on companies, especially in the aerospace defense sector, to ramp up manufacturing. There's definitely a challenge for we want you to move faster, but at the same time, there's sort of no relief on the compliance front. So companies are still struggling with how do we maintain the compliance requirements that we need to support this rapid pace that the government's imposing on us.
Let's drill into several of those. We'll take them one at a time. First, let's talk about growth versus performance reality. You talked about an average 15% revenue growth, but then 90% of the companies that you surveyed reported at least one declining financial metric. So what does that gap tell you about the pressures in terms of managing and controlling costs?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the average is really a reflection of some companies doing rather well or just sort of not noticing any major changes because they happen to be in a good place, in a good sector of the market. We saw the aerospace defense market, as an example, grow by, I think, something like 20+% last year. But then you saw areas that have really been a stalwart of the industry and professional services, the construction industry and IT that were either flat or declining. And so some of the largest contractors in the market had some really strong headwinds related to the DOGE efforts, as well as some of the impacts we saw to agencies like HHS, Department of Education, Agency for International Development. So I think there's some companies that went through some pretty dramatic cost cutting and also are now trying to pivot to how do we get into streams of the market that are faster growing. And so we did notice a major sort of pivot around diversification strategies this year, whether it's through M&A or through growing into white space agencies, other agencies that are growing faster, and even into the state and local and education markets.
You also mentioned AI. This is the first year the report's dedicated an entire chapter to artificial intelligence. What were some of the trends that you saw there and the challenges that companies are facing?
Yeah, well, we already mentioned sort of this rapid growth and utilization, but companies acknowledging that they really don't have the governance structure in place to manage it properly. And I think that's very different from what we saw in prior years where people were sort of treading cautiously in using it and making sure that the governance structure was in place before they leapt in. And now I feel like it's the other way around. They realize the benefits that AI brings and are trying to implement and leverage it as quickly as possible, but they're now outpacing their ability to sort of governance usage. So that was one pattern that emerged. The other one is sort of interesting because as you think about the different functions of government, the financial operations team, business development, project management, some of the areas that you thought would be more advanced in their usage, like I would have thought business development thinking about AI's ability to sort of help with proposal writing and help with capture plans and things like that, we're actually lower on the list of adoption compared to financial operations, where you'd think they would be much more cautious, since I think generative AI is generally not regarded for its math skills. It's more regarded for its, writing and grammar skills. But where we're seeing the most transformational effects mentioned by at least the respondents was in the financial sector. I thought that was really interesting.
That is. Kevin Plexico is Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltek. Kevin, you think about AI governance. One of the other topics you mentioned at the top of the conversation was compliance, governance, cost allocation, cybersecurity, audit readiness, and just a lot more scrutiny in general about contractor operations from this administration. How should contractors be thinking about compliance going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because on the surface, people see FAR overhaul, streamlining, and they think that must be, efforts by the administration, because they've talked about this, helping to bring sort of non-traditional contractors into the market. But when you look at the FAR overhaul, it's much more oriented around streamlining decision making for the contracting community and the acquisition community, not the contractor community. I think in the case of the contractor community, we've seen some executive orders under the prior administration lighten the load around things like climate change and employment diversity, things like that. But we've also seen increases in doubling down on areas like cybersecurity. CMMC was one that people were wondering where that was headed, and clearly that's still a requirement if you're doing business in the Department of Defense. That's looming for many companies. So I think companies need to think of compliance not as a optional sort of thing that we have to do in the back office. It can really turn into a competitive advantage. When you think about a lot of the IDIQs that are being competed, they all give credit for, do you have approved accounting systems? Do you have approved business systems? Do you have CMMI and some of those types of certifications that really differentiate that you've got established processes that the government wants you to have in order to be easy for them to do business with. And I think that's the key change that I've seen, is that compliance becomes really a way for companies to differentiate themselves versus the field of others who haven't invested in that.
The compliance burden we've talked about in the past really is table stakes now, and that hits small businesses especially hard. You found some interesting trends in the small business sector. Tell us about those.
Yeah, well, so this is the first year we've seen small business contracting decline in many years. And I do think that some of that has to do with the dynamic of spending that we talked about. The aerospace defense market, which grew so rapidly, is really not historically been a great area for small businesses. It's dominated by, the large aerospace defense firms. The Defense Department, on average, spends less in small business than many other civilian agencies. And areas like IT, professional services, and architecture, engineering, construction have really been the hotbed for small business participation. So I think that has impacted the small business community. And then when you think about compliance, those requirements are very costly for a small business. It's much more difficult for them to absorb those in their overhead costs than a large business. That's why we're seeing consolidation in this market. And certainly the small business community has faced much more consolidation, despite the increase in spending that we've seen with small business historically. The number of unique small business prime contractors has been on the decline, I think to the tune of 30% over the last decade, which is, significant. And I think that's, in theory, what the administration, it was under the Biden administration, now not under the Trump administration, is trying to reverse. But the things that they're doing aren't really being helpful in the scheme of things. They're sort of, I want to say, giving it a little bit more lip service than real actionable capabilities to help companies that are small absorb some of these compliance costs.
The report does describe a top performer subgroup. When you look at that group, what are the lessons there for the rest of the contractor community?
Well, I think there's a few of them. One, we saw high performers tend to have more diversification, so less dependence on certain set of agencies or customers for their business. So that diversification led to higher win rates. It led to faster growth. I think that's really interesting as a lesson learned for companies that maybe have relied on a certain set of agencies for their business historically. Some of the other metrics, they tend to be more disciplined in their project management, fewer projects that are delayed, fewer projects that are being overrun. So more discipline in project management. And I think as we think about this pivot that we've seen recently from the administration, there was a new executive order that came out recently, really putting fixed price as the default contracting mechanism for contracts going forward. And that does really demand that contractors have more discipline in their project management so that when they're putting in a fixed price bid, they're not really putting at risk their financial health and having these cost overruns and pricing overruns that they're going to have to absorb. So I think high performing companies, more discipline in rigor in their diversification, more discipline and rigor in their project management, and many other elements of their business, frankly.
And as you look toward the rest of 2026, what trends are you watching?
Yeah, certainly the big one is what I like to call the $1 trillion pivot. We're seeing just a huge amount of money being shifted from civilian agency spending, particularly some of the social services agencies like, Department of Education, Housing and Urban Development, some of those types of agencies. And then, of course, we see this request from the administration for $1.5 trillion. So when you count that, basically a half a billion dollar increase requested for the DoD, coupled with the one big beautiful bill from last year, I mean, you're seeing a huge swing in money from many civilian agencies to the Department of Defense, DHS, and immigration, law enforcement agencies, as well as the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I think that has many companies relooking at their pipelines, relooking at their footprint to make sure they're able to address some of these market opportunities that are not easy to just simply pivot to. You can't just say, "Hey, I woke up today and want to do business in the Department of Defense." It takes a huge investment in business development. So we are seeing companies ramp up business development discipline, trying to get into agencies earlier to affect and shape procurements and position themselves in some of those agencies that are growing faster, to pivot out of some of those agencies that look like they're going to be struggling for the next at least 3 years.
I've been speaking with Kevin Plexico. He's Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltek. Kevin, thanks so much for joining me and walking us through this year's report.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for having us on.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, challenging a GAO protest stay override may be getting clearer, but not any easier. But first, federal contractors are doing more than just delivering programs. They're helping the government respond when conditions change quickly. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As Ebola and hantavirus cases draw renewed attention, contractors are part of how the government builds capacity in public health emergencies, especially with large gatherings like the World Cup on the horizon. At the same time, a new Pentagon memo is putting more pressure on how contractors account for facility costs. Jim Carroll, CEO of the Professional Services Council, joins me now to connect those dots. Jim, thanks for joining me this morning.
Thank you, Terry, for having me on.
A topic you and I don't talk a lot about is public health. And certainly it's been in the headlines. The World Health Organization is worried about another outbreak of Ebola. Hantavirus has been in the headlines. There is a role for public contractors to play here. Talk to us about what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there always has been, certainly in modern history, for contractors to play a critical part in healthcare. Some of it is behind the scenes. Some of it is, just the processing of healthcare payments, Medicare, Medicaid, getting those through. But actually, contractors are very much on the front line as well, because they are able to develop the technology that actually helps people and saves lives. And this is the possibility that come about when true subject matter experts are given the expertise and the funding to develop quickly what is needed for public health. And you're right. Every morning, it seems that we wake up and there's something they're talking about. Most recently, it seems, through the weekend, through today, through yesterday, that hantavirus is certainly top of mind. The good news, I'll say before we get anyone too panicky, Terry, is that it does seem to be contained and limited. But what it shows really is the ability of contractors to scale up very quickly for issues in the past. We can't forget COVID. a very sad time for many families and many individuals, as well as the impact on employment. And so, our contractors, our member companies were able to flex back then and quickly provide both the infrastructure, the workforce, as well as some of the research. And we'll be talking about that at PSC later this week as well. The timing is good. The Federal Health Conference for PSC is happening in just a day or two.
Tell me a little more about how contractors are actually providing execution level or operational level support. Where do they plug into the system, and what kind of services are they delivering when it comes to public health?
Yeah, I mean, what we're doing is they're the ones actually sometimes when vaccines are issued, contractors are the ones administering it. There's healthcare experts on the scene. And again, it's that ability to surge healthcare professionals to track it, the tracking that takes place, when they were talking about the last few days with hantavirus and being able to track where people have gone. So much of that is being done by contractors using the technology so that they know where to place people, where to find these individuals, and with whom they might have come in contact. And so it really does show that this is a live demonstration, I think, as what is actually happening with our contractors. And we're going to be talking about these issues with some very critical healthcare folks.
I don't want to leave this topic quite yet because we've got the World Cup coming up in just about a month, bringing people from all around the world into the North American continent.
Right.
What are contractors saying here about the risks they're facing? We usually think about this as a public safety problem, but it's also a public health problem.
Yeah, it is a public safety issue. One of our member companies, for example, on the safety side is providing technology not only at the stadiums themselves, but out in the parking lots where people are surging before and after a game. The technology to be able to keep people safe by monitoring for threats using tethered drones made right here in America. We're actually not too far from us in Virginia, with tethered drones being deployed at some stadiums, again, to sort of watch for safety issues. But we'll also have, and this is one of the things that we'll be talking about, the concerns of health issues and making sure, that with millions of visitors coming in from overseas, that the people across the board are protected and healthy. And so it's a really sort of fascinating time. They're comparing, I think it's 78 games, Terry, for the World Cup, and they're comparing each one to a little bit larger than a Super Bowl in terms of global attendance and, of course, the popularity of going to the game itself. And so, earlier this year, we've had meetings with the head of security from DHS and the White House Task Force on Security for the FIFA games. Now we're talking, our member companies, we're setting up meetings with some of the healthcare folks. For example, the director of NIH, doing all the research and critical funding, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, he is coming to our healthcare conference this week, and our member companies will be talking to him. He'll be telling them the needs as we get closer and closer. And so it really is a timely conversation, and we're going to be able to dig in. Jennifer Johnson of HHS will be there as well. We're just going to have a range of experts about how contractors are playing a critical role and what else is needed. And so how contractors, there's still some time left and still some contracts that are out there, some that are surging now because of these additional healthcare concerns. We're trying to get a sense of those. We'll find out more. But the ability to provide, quick scaling, specialized expertise, and really the role of technology, which is just fascinating.
Jim Carroll is CEO of the Professional Services Council. Jim, I will want an out brief after your session this week so that we can catch up on all of those trends and actions. But I do want to touch on a different topic before we leave today, and that is a new memo in the Pentagon focused on contractor facility costs. What is going on there? What are they signaling? What are they trying to get after?
I think what the DOW is looking for is transparency, which are, at a base level, the contractors, our member companies, are happy to provide. And so the community of government contractors coming out of the Pentagon just want to understand really is what are their overhead costs? What does make sure that as contractors, as all of us. And I'll tell you, Terry, even at PSC, our office is pretty small, but we're reevaluating our facilities cost, looking to see if we're getting the best deal possible. And so this is an encouragement to look at these companies that are doing the same thing. And, the companies want to provide the best value for the taxpayers. Ultimately, they're taxpayers too. And so they understand and support the need for transparency and making these cost efficient and reflect the actual costs that are going out there. I'll just say from an overriding thing, again, we're happy to provide the transparency, work with them. The only thing that I want to make sure that everyone understands on the inside the Pentagon is that these contractors are playing such a critical role that looking into what they are doing is great, but to prejudge it is something that we're trying to make sure. And, Terry, we're used to this every, 4 years with a new administration, a new wave of folks, that it really is sometimes at least educating more than others, but educating folks about, how these costs actually work, making sure that they understand that the prices on some of the materials and technology that are being delivered, the services can vary. And if the government changes the contract midstream, just like if you're remodeling your home and the contractor is halfway through and you put in a change order, which is something I'm very familiar with. Hopefully my wife is listening, that sometimes it changes the bottom line. And it certainly is right now in our kitchen. And so the fact that change orders happen in our kitchen, the same things happen with the government changes their mind or tax slightly differently on a government contract. But we're fully willing and want to be transparent.
Jim, if this is a consensual agreement to be more transparent about overhead costs, is it going to translate into day-to-day operations? Is there going to be an increased reporting requirement or more data transmission or change in pricing strategies? How do you expect it to be implemented?
Yeah, I mean, anytime that there's a request for something that requires more time, that obviously does impact the bottom line. The idea of that transparency into it is perfectly fine. And so, we're happy to provide it, but every nuance that they want differently or put a different way or compared across other things can slow things down. And so, especially at a time when we're facing critical needs around the world for the Department of War and the activities that are taking place globally, our contractors are making great strides and providing not only magazine depth for some of the physical, tangible assets, but also directly on point with PSC are those people who are providing subject matter expertise. And if you're pulling them off during what they know the best to fill out a form, sometimes it's counterproductive.
So, given the operational op-tempo, I guess we'll just say, of what you just described, do you think this memo is really just sort of a messaging signal? Hey, we really do care and we'd like you to start looking at this. Or do you think it's really going to change contractor operations in the short run?
It's probably a little bit too early to be precise. The Department of War Undersecretary Mike Duffy, who was very nice, came to our annual conference at the Greenbrier a couple of weeks ago. We had some one-on-one conversations as well as him speaking, directly from the podium to our executives, to our folks, 400 or so PSC members. I think part of this is signaling that they just want to make sure that they understand, and we'll see how deep they really want to go. Thankfully, Undersecretary Duffy really understands this issue. He has a deep background in government contracting. He's been at OMB. He's been at the department previously. And so he's been a great ally to have, and we have a great working relationship with him and his staff.
I've been speaking with Jim Carroll. He's CEO of the Professional Services Council. Jim, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Take care.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, challenging a GAO protest state override may be getting clearer, but not any easier. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. When a contractor files a bid protest at GAO, the award usually pauses while the protest is reviewed. But recent court decisions are clarifying when agencies can override that stay and how closely judges will examine those decisions afterward. Here to help us understand the complexity of this contingency is Zach Prince, partner at Haynes Boone. Zach, thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
When contractors lose a bid and they go to GAO with a protest, that filing usually freezes the contract while the protest plays out. But sometimes agencies can override that pause. Walk us through the basic mechanics there. What triggers an automatic stay under the Competition and Contracting Act? And what does an agency have to do, at least on paper, to override that?
Sure. So the Competition and Contracting Act, or CICA, comes with an automatic stay of performance or stay of award, depending on whether it's pre or post award challenge, for filing a GAO within a certain specified time period. So assuming you do that within the right amount of time, which can be its own fight, the agency is prevented from acting. But there's recognition, Congress, when they drafted and passed this act, understood that it doesn't always work, because sometimes there are urgent and compelling circumstances that necessitate the government moving forward anyway. So in that case, the agency head has to execute determination of findings, or DNF, documenting that there is this urgent and compelling circumstance significantly affecting interests of the U.S. that will not permit waiting on GAO decision, and then the government gets to proceed with performance or with award, depending on circumstances.
And so why does that override decision matter so much then, both for the government and for the contractor?
Well, from the government side, they get the work done that they need to. And often there are national security interests that are overriding, or other national concerns, and the government gets to proceed. From the contractor's perspective, this makes the bid protest process almost hollow. They might win, and GAO might tell the agency that they were wrong to have awarded to a competitor, but performance might be well underway, and there's not all that much that can be done at that point. I mean, maybe the agency will be told that they should terminate and award to the protester, but you've now lost out on maybe 90-something days of performance, or maybe the work is already done and it's too late.
So there's two recent cases that help clarify this process. Walk us through the active deployment systems case and the life science logistics case. They came out kind of at the same time.
Yeah, they did. So what happens with a CICA override, if you get notice as a protester that the agency is overriding the stay, you have to go to the Court of Federal Claims. And that's where you'll challenge the override decision as arbitrary and capricious and ask the court to stop the agency from moving forward. The way you do it is somewhat of a jurisdictional complication. Typically, folks will go and they'll ask for a temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction. In the life science logistics case, which went up to the Federal Circuit, they asked instead for what's called a declaratory judgment. And this is not a distinction without meaning. It's not just legalese, because when you ask for a preliminary injunction, you have to demonstrate a 4-factor test, not just that you're likely to win on the merits, but also weighing of interests. And it can get complicated. If you just ask for a declaratory judgment, all you have to do is demonstrate that you win on the merits. That is, the agency's decision was arbitrary and capricious. So the life sciences case, I'll start off with that because it's precedential and it's the Federal Circuit. This goes back a little bit. This concerns a award to manage the strategic national stockpile for the capital region. But what that is a nationwide network for storage and deployment of medicines, vaccines, and medical supplies. It's managed by part of HHS, but the contracts for the administration are handled by GSA. There are only a couple contractors that do this kind of work, and the protester in this case, Life Science Logistics, is one of maybe 3 or 4 that are out there. The complicated background of this case, it was challenged, and the procurement decision to award to a competitor was challenged, I think, in 2022. It went back and forth with the agency. Ultimately, the agency issued a CICA override. That is, they said, you know what, we need this, it's important, we're going to go ahead. The Life Science Logistics went to the court. They asked for a declaratory judgment saying the agency was wrong to make this decision. The court agreed, and ultimately it went back to GAO. Life Science Logistics won on the merits, but the agency still appealed the decision to vacate the override to the Federal Circuit. And the reason they did it is because they said the court applied the wrong test. They should have asked for this four-factor analysis that you would apply to a preliminary injunction, not just asking, was it arbitrary and capricious? That is, you have to ask more. You have to ask, what is the balancing of the interest here? And is there an overriding interest of the United States that might override the interests of the protester? Kind of a wonky way to go down this, but ultimately now, 4 years after the first challenge was made in this case, the Federal Circuit agreed with the court and agreed with the protester that the appropriate test is not this four-factor balancing test. It is a simple question of, was the agency acting arbitrarily and capriciously? That is, without any real justification for its decision to override. And if so, then the court will issue a declaratory judgment. They will say, agency, you cannot override. And so the decision will force the agency basically to live with the SICA stay while the GAO decision goes on for maximum 100 days. So we're not talking a long period of time.
Speaking with Zach Prince, he's a partner at Haynes Boone. Zach, catch us up then on the ADS case. How is that different?
So the ADS case was a challenge filed as a preliminary injunction request. So the traditional approach where ADS was disputing at GAO the decision by the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, or FLETC, to award to ADS's competitor for the construction of temporary housing facilities in New Mexico. This is to accommodate CBP agent trainees. So ADS filed its protest March 16th of this year. 2 days later, it was told that the agency was overriding the decision. They justified it on the basis of urgent and compelling need to hire and train CBP agents. They explained that there was no alternative housing available to them. They've got 500 additional trainees a day that they have to house. There were no offsite alternatives. It would have a delay. A delay would have an impact on national security and trainee safety. So they made that override decision. 14 days later, ADS filed suit at the Court of Federal Claims and asked the court to issue a temporary injunction prohibiting the agency from overriding the mandatory SICA stay.
So these two sound like very different contracts for very different services, and yet this override is at the center of them. When you put the two together, what sort of lessons do you take away, and what lessons should contractors be paying attention to here?
So first, just as a procedural matter, if the agency files or tells you that they're going to be overriding a SICA stay and you want to challenge it, make that decision quickly and file it at the Court of Federal Claims as a request for a declaratory judgment. That is, don't go through the process that used to be standard of asking for a preliminary injunction or a temporary restraining order. Instead, the Federal Circuit is very clear. You can just ask for a declaratory judgment. It will make your job easier.
And when you think through this, how should a contractor think about challenging an override decision? What sort of cases do they need to make?
So they need to be able to show that the agency was relying on some impermissible factors when they were making their determination. They failed to consider some important aspect of the overall posture. Their explanations are incoherent or illogical, or their conclusions illogical. Now, there are reasons that as a contractor, you don't want to challenge agency's decision. One is you're going to be annoying your customer. But two is there really might be very justifiable national security interests at stake here. And you have to know the situation and know whether that is likely to prevail, that is the agency's invocation of national security. And really, as a matter of policy, if their invocation of national security is appropriate. You might agree with them and you'd like them to have given it to you and let the SICA stay ride. But I've been involved in situations where it's obvious that there is, say, an urgent health issue and the agency can't wait. So you might want to challenge the SICA stay, but sometimes you just won't anyway.
Been speaking with Zach Prince. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Zach, I really appreciate you walking us through these two cases. It sounds like there's a lot here for both agency contracting officers and the contractors themselves to consider.
Absolutely right. So agencies need to be thoughtful about this process. And It's built into the law, a mechanism for the agencies to get what they need when they need it, notwithstanding the protest function. But that really should be reserved and typically is reserved for very unusual circumstances. It's not where the situation is urgent and compelling because you let things wait too long, which has occasionally happened. It's not where there are obvious alternatives. It's where this is a real national security issue or this is a real emergency. And that's going to justify not waiting even the 100 days for GAO to issue a decision.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Navy is ensuring its officers at the highest levels understand how artificial intelligence works as it adopts and integrates it into its warfighting functions. The Naval Postgraduate School is at the center of those efforts, providing both the courses and the technology to drive that learning. For more on what NPS is doing, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, caught up with Randy Pugh, Vice Provost for Warfare Studies, Director of the Office of Warfare Studies, and the lead of the AI Task Force.
The first thing that we're trying to do is get people educated about AI. What is it? What isn't it? What are the risks? Where is the technology today? Where is it going? And then also the skills to do things. So to have hands on keyboard or to lead teams of advanced users or developers, as well as leaders, to make sure that leaders understand about priorities and policy and those kinds of things so that we can responsibly and quickly adopt and integrate AI into our warfighting functions. And so we teach classes, we sponsor classes, we teach classes. Our relationship with NVIDIA allows us access to their Deep Learning Institute, which is commercial certifications in all these different aspects of machine learning, modeling and simulation, advanced graphic processing unit, GPU-based hypercompute. And so all of that, the primary effort is to get everybody as smart and capable as possible in AI. And then the other gifts from NVIDIA via the NPS Foundation are the $15 million AI supercomputer, which is being installed now at Naval Postgraduate School, one of a kind in the Defense Department. Serial number 2 coming off the NVIDIA assembly line is coming to the Naval Postgraduate School so that everybody will be able to see it first there and put their hands on it there first. And then modeling and simulation platform, a $5 million Omniverse instance that we have for modeling and simulation, training the brains of robots and drones in a virtual sense before you put them into the bodies, mechanical bodies. And then also this NVIDIA AI Tech Center, which connects the students and faculty at MPS back to NVIDIA headquarters, and then also and all of the subject matter expertise there, as well as to the larger NVIDIA ecosystem, which is 15,000 partners working on AI-related projects. And so it's a tap into that incredible corpus of knowledge and experience, use cases, and potential solutions for the Department of the Navy and the Marine Corps.
As you went through all the opportunities that you're kind of giving the students, you mentioned education, infrastructure, problem solving. So let's maybe jump through each of those. From an education perspective, I know Admiral Vernazza talked about some education opportunities, a master's degree. Talk a little bit about that effort that you worked with him on, and then we can go maybe deeper into what the education is looking like today and where is it going in the future.
Admiral Vernazza is the type commander, the Navy Information Forces type commander for all the information warfare officers, and immediately recognized the value of one of our proposals, which was to establish a 1-year Master's of Science degree in Artificial Intelligence. And so for those that are exceptionally well qualified, you already have an undergraduate in computer science, for example, or you've done programming, you understand machine learning, you're able to jump into this degree program and in 1 year achieve a Master of Science in AI degree. Another thing that Admiral Vernazza and his team understand is the value of these officers when they exit the program in the first cohort in the summer of 27. And when they exit the program, they're identifying these billets or these jobs within the operating force, the supporting establishment, and the headquarters, where they can go and continue to inform people about AI and educate people about what AI is and is not and can and cannot do, but to also lead those efforts as change agents and thought leaders within those organizations to accelerate the adoption and integration of AI in the Navy.
When you set up the master's degree, what were some of the considerations? Because the challenge, of course, is AI is changing so much, right? From over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, we went from, hey, AI, we can apply it, to, hey, we have this thing called generative AI. Now everyone wants to talk about agentic AI. A year from now, we could be talking about whatever the fourth phase of AI is. How did you set it up to ensure that these folks are going to be as up-to-date as possible when they do come out?
MPS does a really good job. So an undergraduate degree is you prove that you can learn things. A master's degree is you're able to learn things. You're able to then learn how to learn, and so you become a lifelong learner through the accomplishment of earning a master's degree, as well as combining basic and theoretical underpinnings of a technology with the things that are evolving through advanced research as the state of the practice evolves. And so this degree is really well balanced because it provides a foundation in things that have not changed. How does machine learning work, for example? What is supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning? And these are concepts that are enduring. But then the second half of the year is really about taking electives or learning about the new technologies or the new techniques that are evolving with AI, and then most of all putting it together into solving a problem as part of your thesis or capstone project for the degree program.
How many people are going through this first cohort, and is there going to be a second, third, and fourth cohort, assuming this goes well?
I believe there will be a second and third and fourth, and it will evolve over time. But the first program that we're running this summer is a pilot, and it's sponsored by and championed by Admiral Vernaza. And we're going to provide metrics and understand the return on investment for this cohort with the expectation that, one, we will change it over time, learning by doing, but also that we will make a determination at some point either to shift to something else, to cancel it, or to continue it, or to accelerate it and offering more opportunities for officers to come and gain this degree.
And again, just roughly how many people are in the cohort?
And the cohort size is 20 for this initial pilot program.
And this is because it's a master's degree, it's their full-time job. They're at MPS, they're going 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, so on and so forth. And it goes on for the full year.
That's right. So it's an in-resident program. So the 4 classes per quarter, we're on a quarter system, 4 classes per quarter for 4 quarters. And again, the last part is the thesis and capstone and electives. But it is a full-time job, including nights and weekends, unfortunately. It is a rigorous program intended to get as much done in a short amount of time as possible.
And generally speaking, and then I want to move on to some other pieces of the task forces, this is open only to sailors and Marines? Or is it open to anybody else in the...
Because Admiral Vernaza is the sponsor of the pilot project, he gets to determine who comes into the cohort. But initial conversations have indicated that there's interest there in the diversity of the cohort. So instead of all information warfare officers, including other warfare specialties, as well as Marines, as well as potentially international officers or civilians, to ensure we get that same goodness that we get from other courses at MPS or programs at MPS of the diversity of experiences and diversity of perspectives as they go through this program. And then also those communities would understand the return on investment if they wanted to sponsor the next one or make this a standard offering at Naval Postgraduate School.
You talked about infrastructure to do AI, and you talked about problem solving as kind of 2 other pieces to this. You mentioned infrastructure with all the work you're doing with the private sector. Is there more to talk about from an infrastructure perspective in the sense of how are you testing tools? How are you, what goes into this idea of, okay, is this the right capability and how do we apply AI to it, or is this the right AI capability and do we have a use case for it?
When NVIDIA came to us and offered us gift, one of the missions Jensen Huang, the CEO, made was that they had a great understanding of commercial use cases and the infrastructure required to support those and timelines and things like that, or the difficulty of training models, but they did not have a lot of understanding of military use cases or the associated challenges of applying AI to these use cases. And so we're going to learn by doing, by establishing this infrastructure at MPS, and then kind of running it red hot for the next year or 2. And through doing that, the other thing we're learning is as we look to help others establish their infrastructure, either at the tactical edge, so out on a ship or in a submarine or in an expeditionary advanced base with Marines, what is the kind of infrastructure that you're going to need in order to do that? And so the three lines of effort are interdependent. So as we're establishing the infrastructure to support our own efforts, we're learning about what that takes and what kind of infrastructure you need, which feeds into the education line of effort as well. And we'll offer classes, for example, probably later this year in infrastructure for military operations enabled by AI.
Randy Pugh is the Vice Provost for Warfare Studies, the Director of the Office of Warfare Studies, and the lead of the AI Task Force at the Naval Postgraduate School, speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. You can find Jason's full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.